This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 633 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. I can't even explain how excited I am for this NFL draft. We need landing spots for these guys. We need to move on from the speculation. I think we're all ready for it. On today's show, I'll do what I do every year, and that's talk through the top end of my rookie rankings. It's a pretty straightforward show. Keep in mind that things will change once the draft is over. I'll eventually do an episode with my post-draft rankings, but if you want or need them very close to after the draft is over, go purchase the Late Round Prospect Guide. It's $14.99, and I'll be sending out a revised version soon after the draft. I've been asked when that revised version will go out, and I can at least say that my goal is Monday or Tuesday after the draft. I'm going to be working all weekend to get that thing done so you guys have everything that you need to crush your rookie drafts. So go check that out on lateround.com. You'll get way more information on this year's class in that guide than what you're going to hear on today's show. Now, before we get into things, the 2022 NFL Draft is set to take place on Thursday, April 28th, as we know, and FanDuel has a completely free-to-play contest that allows you to get in on the action. Introducing FanDuel's Mock the Draft Free Play, a fantasy contest that gives you a chance to win a share of $10,000 in cash. All you have to do is try to predict the top 10 players chosen in the draft in correct order. Each correct selection will earn you 2 FanDuel points, while each selection within one pick of the correct selection will receive half a FanDuel point. Earn the most points and you could walk away with a $2,000 first place prize. For more details, visit FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel Fantasy app. Eligibility restrictions apply. So I'm going to split today's episode up by tier. And the first tier is a player all by himself, and that's Breece Hall. We'll see what kind of draft capital Hall gets, but he's been rising ever since the Combine where he had monster measurables. My prospect model only cares about speed score or weight-adjusted 40 time, and it only cares about players hitting a threshold. Breece Hall obviously hit that. But the threshold thing is likely because a lot of athleticism measurables are captured in draft capital. And draft capital is part of my models. So athleticism isn't that much of an input, both at running back and at wide receiver. It's not at all at wide receiver. But it likely is shifting players up and down in draft capital. That's why we've seen a lot of speculation of Hall going higher and higher in the draft over the last couple of months. I still don't think that he goes in the first, but according to NFL Mock Draft Database, Hall has a projected draft slot of 36 overall. And at 36 overall, we're looking at a 97th percentile prospect in my model. If you recall, I mentioned earlier this offseason that my model didn't have any running back in this class in that Najee Harris, Travis Etienne, Javonte Williams tier. But it does now. Breece Hall is in that tier. He checks every box. He's got ideal size, he's young, he looks good in the 3 production metrics that my model looks at. There really isn't any glaring red flag analytically. And he's the only back in this class without an obvious concern. And for the record, the 3 comps from my prospect guide for Breece Hall: Rashad Penny, Ezekiel Elliott, Dalvin Cook. Anything can happen, but he looks like he'll have a very high ceiling in fantasy football. And he should be the first overall pick in all formats. Now, after Hall, we get into a pretty large tier. At the start of draft season for me, I was convinced that there was a tier of 3 really good wide receivers who were bound to go in round 1. But I've expanded that tier to 5 now. There are 5 wide receivers who look like locks to get selected in the first round. And those 5 wide receivers make up my second tier. I wouldn't be surprised if any of these players ranked at the top after the draft. That's why they're all in the same tier. That's how I work tiers. But let's start with Garrett Wilson, who I technically have as my wide receiver 1 in the second overall pick in rookie drafts. Of all the wide receivers projected to go on night 1, I think Wilson is the safest bet to be solid in the NFL. He may not have the highest ceiling because he's not the prototypical X receiver that we see with high fantasy ceilings in the NFL. Wilson's 183 pounds, and he's going to go up against corners who are much bigger than him in the NFL. That's a concern. But he's incredibly solid across the board analytically. He has a good breakout age around 20 years old. He has a top 7 best season receiving yards per team pass attempt rate in this class. That's the most important production metric that my model looks at. And he produced alongside 2 other first-round wide receivers at Ohio State. Technically, 3 of them if you want to include Jameson Williams. Because Wilson got the nod over Williams when they were sophomores together at Ohio State. With projected draft capital in the top 10, Wilson is a 98th percentile wideout in that model. Since 2011, 35% of wide receivers in that range, in that 95 to 100th percentile range, have given us at least one season of 18 or more PPR points per game across their first 3 years in the league. For some context, that would have ranked as the wide receiver 5 last year. So Garrett Wilson is in a very good spot. When I published the late round prospect guide, though, I had Treylon Burks as my wide receiver 2. He's not my wide receiver 2 anymore. That's where Drake London is. I think you could argue London as the wide receiver 1 in this class pretty easily, especially if you're chasing ceiling. Like Garrett Wilson, London played alongside some NFL caliber players, albeit they weren't as good as the competition that Wilson was likely playing against. I say likely because these guys haven't all been drafted yet. That's what we're projecting. But London played with Michael Pittman and Amon-Ra St. Brown. He even outproduced St. Brown in some categories on a per-game basis despite being a year younger. I think it's easy to argue that London might have the best age-adjusted production profile in this class. And the biggest red flag in that profile is probably the fact that he got a lot of production on contested catches. And we don't know how that's going to translate. There's some fear there because we've seen players like this not translate in recent memory, like N'Keal Harry and J.J. Arcega-Whiteside. Arcega-Whiteside's about to play tight end now. That's why London's floor is scarier than someone like Garrett Wilson, who's more of a technician. But if you want to chase ceiling, it's there for London. He's 6'4", 219 pounds, with comparables in my model to T. Higgins and Mike Evans. The elite upside is absolutely there. Now, I do have Treylon Burks at wide receiver 3, but again, he's in this giant tier of 5 wide receivers. Burks is one of 2 wide receivers in my model with the best season yards per team pass attempt of 3.2 and a touchdown share over 50%. Overall, the production profile looks fine. But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a little bit nervous about how the NFL might view Treylon Burks and how his game might translate to the league. He largely played as a slot receiver in college, so we didn't get that big of a sample size of him against press coverage. PFF actually charted him at just 39 snaps against press in 2021. Among the 5 wide receivers in this tier, as it stands today, he actually has the lowest score in the model at a 94th percentile score. There's nothing wrong with that. That's a good score. But his dropping projected draft slot is worrisome, as is the fact that he didn't have the beastly combine that a lot of people projected. He could end up playing more of a Juju Smith-Schuster role than an A.J. Brown role in the NFL as a result. And that would limit upside. And that's assuming that he hits. So I like Treylon Burks, I recognize the upside, but there are some concerns. Next is Chris Olave. I'm not digging Olave a whole lot because of his lack of early declare status. Mostly because his numbers would have looked similar last year anyway. And because he was still productive this past year in an offense with, again, a couple of first-round picks. Yes, he was more senior to them, but he still was able to produce. I think Olave is another instance like Garrett Wilson, where he's a safer option than Burks in London. But he may not flash the same kind of upside from a fantasy football perspective. He does have an issue with the ball in his hands where he didn't break a whole lot of tackles in college, but he's a great route runner and he can win deep. I know Matt Harmon, who charts these guys for reception perception, he said that Chris Olave was the best route runner in this class. Olave has almost a 97th percentile score in my model with top 20 draft capital. We'll see where he ends up, but if he somehow falls to the 20s and like Green Bay gets him, or maybe a team like Kansas City trades up, it would not be a surprise if he's the consensus wide receiver 1 in this class post-draft. And I think you can make a similar argument for Jameson Williams. That's why I have both of these guys in this tier now. Williams doesn't necessarily have the same type of analytical profile as the other guys in this tier because he didn't do much at all when he was at Ohio State. But he transferred to Alabama and he blew up. A couple of mailbag episodes ago, I got a question about Jameson Williams' transfer status and whether or not we should be concerned about that. My answer was that no, we shouldn't be. Because really, he was losing work at Ohio State to Chris Olave, who was older than him, and Garrett Wilson, who's a very good prospect. And it's not like Williams went to Toledo. He transferred to Alabama. And at Alabama, he put together a great season. A lot of his numbers in my prospect model actually aligned pretty well to another Alabama wide receiver, Calvin Ridley. Some have Williams as their wide receiver 1 in this class. Alfredo Brown did, as a lot of you guys heard on the wide receiver episode from just a few weeks ago. I do think there's a chance that he's the top wide receiver selected in this draft because of his ability to separate and his ability to make plays down the field. He fits in today's NFL. He's sort of got like a Jalen Waddle vibe right now. So today, pre-draft, he's in tier 2 as my wide receiver 5. Next week, he could be my wide receiver 1 depending on how the draft goes down. He's a very good wide receiver. Tier 3 starts with Kenneth Walker. I do think that Walker is a phenomenal runner. And he's got the 5th best season total yards per team play rate in this class. That's one of the bigger production metrics within the model for running backs. But yeah, you guys know this by now. Walker's downfall is his receiving profile. His best season 5.4% reception share is absolutely a concern. Even if you believe that he can be a pass catcher at the next level, which of course that's in his range of outcomes, it's still a concern. We haven't seen a running back drafted between pick 32 and 100 since 2011 give us a true RB1 season in points per game during his first 3 years in the league with a sub 8% best season reception share. Kenneth Walker's at 5.4%. And there were 17 of those running backs. And that rate jumps dramatically when looking at the alternative, when looking at running backs who did catch passes. Now that's something I've already talked about on this show. I talked about that a couple of mailbag episodes ago. You can go back to listen to that if you want more detail. I want to be brief here in order to fit in as many players as possible, but the bottom line with Walker is that there's a big piece to his production profile that's missing. It doesn't mean it'll come to fruition and truly matter, but it does mean to me that he's not in the same tier as some of the really good wide receivers who are projected to go in round 1. And I think that's a totally reasonable stance to have. Now, I got 3 wide receivers in this tier as well. And the first one is George Pickens. There aren't a ton of true X receivers in this class, and that's partially what makes Pickens attractive. We usually see this prototype have higher ceilings in fantasy football. Now, admittedly, my model doesn't like Pickens as much as I do. And that's largely because Pickens dealt with injury in college, and his most productive season came as a freshman as a result. But that also gave him one of the best breakout ages that you can find. He's got plenty of length, and he should have early second-round draft capital. He might have first-round draft capital. Now, the last time I did a little projecting within my model to make a case for a second-round wide receiver with size, it was just a year ago with Terrace Marshall. I wrote about this at length in my prospect guide. But I don't think the mistake with Marshall was liking him last year and doing a little projecting. The mistake was then over-ranking him versus what the model was saying. They were all in the same tier, but I put Marshall above guys like Rashad Bateman and Elijah Moore post-draft. I noted that Marshall was an upside play, but that was still a mistake when my model loved Rashad Bateman and Elijah Moore. There's a chance I do bump Pickens into the tier above if he gets the right capital and goes to a spot like Green Bay this week. But where I rank him will depend on where the other top 5 wideouts settle. If I have to make a big stretch like I did for Terrace Marshall last year, who was almost 10 percentile spots lower than those 2 other wide receivers that I talked about in his class, I won't do that. I learned my lesson to rely more on my model. So with Pickens, the bottom line is this. I think his ceiling is there. I wouldn't be surprised at all if he's the best wide receiver in this class. The production as a freshman at Georgia is really impressive. But I'm going to be more reasonable with my approach within my rankings. I want to rely on what objectively looks right. Now, the next player in this tier is Sky Moore, my wide receiver 7. Everyone who listens to this show knows that I love me some Sky Moore. But as the draft process has gone on, everyone else seems to love Sky Moore too. So the value isn't necessarily as glaring as it once was. Moore gets hurt in my model a bit because he's not coming from a big program. But the good news is that he's a small school early declare, which we don't see very often. And his production profile is fantastic. I'm going to read part of the Sky Moore profile from my prospect guide just to give you guys an idea of how good his profile is. It says, yes, he went to a smaller school, but within this class, he ranks 5th in best season receptions per game, 4th in best season yards per team pass attempt, and 9th in best season touchdown share. He's the only player in this class with top season marks of at least 7 receptions per game, a 3.4 yards per team pass attempt rate, and a 40% touchdown share. If you use those filters and look at players since 2011 to hit those numbers while being picked in the top 70, Moore is currently projected to go 61st overall, you get quite the list of successes. Cooper Kupp, Tyler Boyd, Amari Cooper, Tyler Lockett, Jordan Matthews, Sammy Watkins, Allen Robinson, Andy Isabella, Devontae Smith, and Elijah Moore. Basically, the only miss in that group looks to be Andy Isabella. Even Jordan Matthews had some decent seasons to appreciate and value at the start of his career. My top comparable for Sky Moore is DJ Moore. I am very high on him. And Moore is a great example of why, from a fantasy perspective, this wide receiver draft class does have some depth. I don't think we'll see a ton of hits from players outside the top 15 at the position per se, but the top 10 is really solid. There just isn't this Jamar Chase-like prospect to make the class really stand out. And then the last player in this tier is Jahan Dotson. He's not an early declare wideout, but he's one of those cases where he still would have looked pretty good in my model had he come out last year. He has top 10 numbers in best season receiving yards per team pass attempt and touchdown share in this class. Those are two production metrics that my model looks at. He's a playmaker. He not only could make splash plays in college, but he was a punt returner for Penn State as well. That doesn't get signal in my model, but it's something a little extra that you love to see from prospects, because coaches generally put their biggest playmakers in those positions in college. I think there is some concern over size with Dotson, and one of his comparables in my model ended up being Vincent Brown. That's not great, but he did comp pretty well to T.Y. Hilton. That's sort of the ceiling that we're working with here. And with him getting mocked pretty frequently to the end of the first round, there's a chance that we see him get a really nice landing spot too. I think that Jahan Dotson is a very solid prospect. Now, I have a tier break when going from Dotson to Christian Watson. You're probably not that surprised by this if you listened to the mailbag episode from last week. Watson's not a bad prospect. I just think there are more red flags and concerns with his profile compared to the 8 wide receivers that I've already talked about. He's coming from a smaller program. That's a flag. His receiving yards per team pass attempt rate is good, but it's not so over the top amazing given where he went to school. He had a best season touchdown share of 35%, a mark hit by 15 other wide receivers in this class. There's nothing special there. Again, he's not bad. He has great size. You can get really creative with him schematically, and he's a freak athlete. The latter point is what I think is driving up his potential cost in the draft. And I'll just reiterate what I said on Friday's show. Athleticism does not matter to me at wide receiver in my model. Likely because, like I said earlier, it's fully captured in draft capital. So I don't want to double count that. He does compare favorably to DJ Chark, but I also think there's a chance that this is another Denzel Mims situation. Watson has a really wide range of outcomes. I could see him hitting like a Chase Claypool did, but let's not pretend that we haven't seen these uber athletic wide receivers bust in the past. That's why I have him here and not ahead of someone like Dotson, because Dotson to me is a much safer prospect. Now, after Watson, I've got Isaiah Spiller, and I'll be honest with you guys, running back is really hard to figure out after Kenneth Walker. Spiller went from fantasy darling to someone a lot of people were fading after he displayed very little athleticism the last couple of months. His pro day 40 ended up being a 4.64, and depending on how you adjust that could make his speed score just under 90. And 90 is the threshold that I look for in running backs before they get severely hurt in my model. Technically, Spiller doesn't look as good in my model because of that, but he still has a shot to be the RB3 in this class outright if draft capital is in his favor, and I think it will be. He does have decent marks in reception share and total yards per team play, and he's got the right size to be a featured back. We can't discount those things. One of his comps in my model is actually Joe Mixon, but how I feel about Spiller will depend almost entirely at this point on how the NFL feels about him. I think he's still going to be a mid-day 2 pick, but we'll see. Now, right next to Spiller in my rankings, Rachaad White. White's someone that I think the fantasy community likes a lot more than the NFL does. And don't get me wrong, I like him a lot. He could end up being one of the most versatile pass catchers at running back in this class. He had almost a 21% reception share last year, and he's sort of a leaner back at 6 foot, 214 pounds, meaning you could maybe line him up at wide receiver. It took a while for him to produce, though. He played some JUCO ball before getting to Arizona State 2 years ago, and he didn't produce really until last year. I don't think we should lose sight of that. He's intriguing, though, with a top comparable in my model of David Johnson. I think he can play a really interesting receiving role in the NFL, and we know that's favorable for fantasy scoring. We just have to see where his draft capital ends up. And then the last player that I want to talk about today, the last player in this tier, David Bell. Bell is falling a lot in rookie drafts, whether it's a real rookie draft before the NFL draft or a mock draft. And it's because he bombed the combine. He's not athletic. You can't sell him as someone who's going to burn by defenders. He lacks explosion. That's definitely a concern. And he may fall a lot in the draft because of that. If he does, I'll be more and more worried about his potential in the NFL. But Bell has a really good production profile in my model. And more importantly, it's a good age-adjusted profile. He immediately produced as a freshman at Purdue. He had 86 catches and over 1,000 yards. Bell has projected draft capital in my model of 80th overall right now. And at 80th overall, he ranks in the 84th to 85th percentile. That's better than Christian Watson as a 40th overall pick, just for context. It doesn't mean I'm ranking Bell over Watson, clearly. But it does show you that math likes Bell probably a lot more than the market does right now. And the nice part about Bell, honestly, is that the opportunity cost is not significant anymore. If he was a player who couldn't separate, who you had to grab at the end of the first round of your rookie draft, that's a tough sell. But he's not that anymore. No one is drafting him there. So you can buy into the higher range of outcomes with him a little bit easier. And there are players with a similar profile who've been fine at the NFL level. Devontae Adams comps really favorably to David Bell, actually. Though Adams was just a little bit more athletic. Anquan Bolden's another one of those players who didn't separate, but had good body control, and he knew how to use his bigger frame. That's where Bell can win. There are tons of negatives to that kind of profile, don't get me wrong, and a ton of busts with that kind of profile as well. But you shouldn't have to worry about that given his projected rookie cost, unless he gets drafted a lot higher than expected this week and his rookie cost increases. So I like David Bell overall a little bit more than the market right now. But that's it. Those are my pre-draft tiers at the top. I know some of you may want more takes, and remember, you can get those takes by purchasing the late round prospect guide over on lateround.com. I'll have everything updated right after the draft so you can see where I'm ranking these guys and what my model is saying about them. But that's going to do it for today's show. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to be doing the mailbag episode a day early this week because of the draft, so get your questions in right away. I'll talk to you then.